it's actually incredible for women to lean into their female energy. There is a lot of greatness, like being a compassionate leader, for example. And I can look feminine, show up in a traditionally feminine way, and still close deals and still make money. In the past, we felt like these are mutually exclusive because we wanted to reduce women to their stereotypes, but we can actually do both and kick ass while doing so.
Welcome to Very Beginning, a podcast where we shift the narrative from happy ending to exciting beginning. My name is Anastasia, and through conversations with inspiring entrepreneurs, athletes, influencers, and all around trailblazers, I'm looking to explore how we can get more comfortable with change and find the courage to unlock that scary first chapter to something we've been wanting to do for far too long. So, without further ado, and so it begins. Thamina, let's take it from the very beginning. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. Really looking forward to this conversation.
I'm so excited to have you on today because you are probably the definition of a trailblazer. I always like to start off by talking about the impact a person has on other people and their community, and you very, very openly share topics on diversity and inclusion, fertility, gender equity on various platforms. And it's impressive to see, reading the comments, how people are engaging, how people are really feeling like you've touched them personally, emotionally. And it's just really incredible to see all this work you're doing. But I mean, you don't stop there. It seems really like you have more than 24 hours in a day, because apart from, well, you can really call it being a thought leader, you're also working full-time at LinkedIn in New York City. You founded your own platform called Give Her Dollars, and you're actually also a podcast host. You're a speaker, advisor, and investor. And just want to mention, rightfully so, you were in the list of 100 Women of 2022 released by Focus magazine in Germany, which is basically the equivalent to Forbes. So extremely, extremely impressive. I am so excited for this conversation. So to start things off, I would love to kind of take it to really the beginnings of your career, even before you started in the corporate space. Can you tell me a little bit more about that time where you went to the US? You did your year, or what was supposed to be a year abroad, but then you decided to really stay there. What impact did this time have on you?
First of all, thank you so much for your kind words initially. Really, really appreciate it. Gender equality advocacy is just something that I'm incredibly passionate about, and so I cannot shut up about it. And I just want to, inspire other women around the globe to really lean in there and become better advocates for themselves, may that be through their personal finances and investing, or their careers, but also their personal lives. So thank you so much for providing a space where I can tell my story. To your question, going back, so it's pretty interesting because and that's how you and I met initially. Like, I thought I was going to end up in journalism. My dad is a journalist. I've always enjoyed writing and languages, and started working for a radio station back home in Munich, Germany, and wanted to become a sports reporter. Like, I've always loved sports, watching soccer, playing sports, like all of that good stuff. But then I made a complete pivot when I moved to the United States for, as you were mentioning, what was supposed to be only 1 year abroad. 1 year abroad in the US turned into 4, because I loved my university, Duke University, so much that I decided to stay and finish my undergraduate degree there. And it was at Duke where I was exposed to completely new narratives around gender equity, but also racial equity. I was able to really focus on women's studies within my political science major and learn a lot about women in leadership, gender stereotypes, and the systemic oppression and discrimination a lot of women are still facing to this day. And it made me really, really angry. And so I wanted to create awareness for that. I then founded a local He for She chapter. For those of you who might not be familiar with He for She, it's It's an initiative by UN Women. Actress and activist Emma Watson was the global face of this initiative. So I launched a social media campaign on our campus to challenge gender stereotypes, and that kind of like kicked off everything. And while being a student at Duke, I took a lot of courses within our innovation entrepreneurship program, which exposed me to the world of tech, startups, investing. So I decided to make a career pivot, say goodbye to a potential career in journalism, and pivoted to the world of tech, and then eventually started working for LinkedIn in October of 2018. And on the side, I started building an audience and the personal brand within that space. And am very, very passionate about women's financial health specifically because I believe that the world that we live in would be a much different and much better place if we were able to get more money into the hands of women, because when women are financially secure, they can really focus on bettering society. And we also know that women tend to invest more alongside their values and what they believe is better for their children, their communities, and our planet as a whole. So I do think that if women were more financially secure, we would be able to create
Mm-hmm.
sustainable and meaningful change.
100%. I mean, super, super important work that you're doing, and so, so, so impressive. I think a couple of things you said when it's kind of interesting, right? That you said you wanted to be in journalism, and I actually had a similar background. I also always saw myself in journalism, and now I also ended up more on the fintech side. When you kind of made that pivot, how did this feel for you? Was there a lot of, because you said even your dad is a journalist, was a lot of support from your family side, being really just go out, do what you like to do? Or did you feel like, wait, I'm kind of pivoting away from this path that I studied, from this path that was laid out in my family? And did it feel super scary to now try out this new space of tech?
For me, I've always been the kind of person that when I get excited about something, I just like go right in and dig deep, without any fear, and going after it with poise and being unapologetic about it. And I think, to be honest, my dad was probably a bit relieved that I chose a different career path, because like he grew up in an environment that was very different from the journalism and the media environment that we see
Yeah.
today. Back when he was training to become a journalist, those were like the glory days of journalism, you know, in the early 90s, right? There was a lot of money and power in the media industry, but that has shifted so much with the advent of certainly Web 2.0,
Mm-hmm.
right? So nowadays, unfortunately, there isn't that much money to be made anymore in journalism. Obviously, journalism and like freedom of press is still incredibly important. But throughout my college career, I just noticed that I am an entrepreneur at heart. I love building and creating things from scratch. So my family was very important for them. The most important thing is that I'm happy and that I'm engaged in what I do. So it was a pretty smooth transition, and then also having all the incredible resources that Duke was providing me with, from a guidance and mentorship perspective, and then seeing badass women in the space who are visible role models, definitely further encouraged me to go down that path.
That's awesome. And I mean, you said it, like seeing other people do it, right? Or seeing badass women doing it really helped you. So I think that is like the reason, probably, right? Why it's so important to have these role models, these people who speak up, really people like you, right? Who are unapologetically themselves, like you said, and are not afraid to touch upon subjects that are really sensitive. And on that note, I did see that one of your posts on LinkedIn, which I think was one of like the most liked and posts that had the biggest engagements, was around the topic of your time after you graduated in the US. You talk really open about something called post graduation depression. I think it even coincided a bit with COVID, but would just love for you to tell me, if you like, a little bit more about this time, how this felt for you, and how you really managed to go to get through it.
Absolutely. So what I refer to as post-graduation depression is that period after someone graduates from school or from university, if they were so fortunate to be able to attend university, where all of a sudden you don't have these predefined milestones ahead of you anymore, and you kind of have to make them up by yourself. So what I mean by that, if you think about it, someone who is maybe 18 years old or like in their early 20s, the vast majority of their lives, they had these predefined milestones. They knew after first grade comes second grade, after middle school comes high school. Again, if you're so fortunate to be able to attend college, you go to university afterwards, right? So you always know
Yeah.
what's next, what happens next year, right? And that adds a lot of structure to your life. But once you graduate, that structure isn't there anymore, so you kind of have to make that up by yourself. And I feel we were all pretty ill equipped to do so and navigate parts of our lives, such as, personal finance, for example, our mental health, networking, building a personal brand, finding our purpose in life, right? So that is something that I was really struggling with, establishing a new sense of identity that was not tied to being a student anymore. And I felt completely lost. And I didn't really talk about it in the beginning because, on paper, everything looked great. I was so privileged to have graduated from one of the top universities in the world. I was working for a great company, right? So on paper, I was living that perfect life that like millions and millions of people would
Yeah.
would kill for, right? But it didn't align with how I felt on the inside. Like I said, I felt so lost, suffering from major anxiety, which ended up being depression for quite some time, probably for like the first 2 to 3 years post graduation. And it wasn't until I started talking to other friends of mine when I realized that, hey, I'm not the only one who's going through this. So I found out throughout this process that we're all kind of like suffering in silence because we're all too afraid and too ashamed to admit that we're really struggling. And it didn't really matter where in the world someone was, how prestigious their employer was, or how much money they were making. We're all kind of struggling. And it really helped to start talking about it and create a space specifically with my FemHive podcast where we could have these very open and vulnerable conversations, and had so many people my age reach out to me like, hey, like, thank you so much for creating and holding the space. I've actually been suffering as well, and it's actually great to hear that I'm not the only one who's going through a similar experience.
And I mean, that is the power of sharing, right? The power of creating this community and really realizing, like, hey, you're not alone in this. Like, when I graduated and I also studied in the US, I also had this whole issue of, being on a visa. It's really hard in the US to get hired when you're on a visa. And it also it felt like, oh my God, I'm alone going through all these struggles. But then just opening up, and I mean, I didn't do it as publicly as you, but just, speaking out to your friends or your family, it really helped to connect and really helped to find people who might be, going through the similar things. So you didn't have to suffer alone, like you said. So I think that just really goes to show this power of creating connections when you speak up and when you're just not afraid to share something that might make you seem or feel vulnerable.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think when you started the FemHive podcast, that was pretty much in the midst of COVID, right? I think you said it was 2020. So was it really kind of that experience with post-graduation depression that inspired you to start this? Or was it, that you just had some free time during COVID to do it? Because I feel like during COVID, many people, use the extra time to break bread or brownies. So I think it's super cool that you actually used it to start like a new side hustle.
Thank you. I would say it was a mix of both. Like, I knew for quite some time leading up to my actual launch in the summer of 2020, I was really craving for something that I could do on the side in addition to my 9 to 5, where I would have a bit more agency, responsibility, and could also do something that would kind of like satisfy my entrepreneurial needs and allow me to have a creative outlet. And having a background in journalism and then specifically radio, launching a podcast just seemed very natural to me. I know how to write for audio. I had the editing skills, right? So I felt comfortable reaching out to people and recruiting people as guests and having a conversation with them. But to be honest, I didn't really have like a set plan. The idea was really like, hey, I've been struggling with this. I know now after having one-on-one conversations that I'm not the only person struggling, and yet nobody's talking about that in the public, right? So let me create that space. I always knew that I wanted it to benefit young female professionals, but I didn't have like a set plan. Okay, this is exactly what I'm going to do. This is where I want to be in 3, 6, 12 months from now. So I really wanted it to grow organically. And yes, obviously, pandemic hit, changed a couple of plans because I was supposed to move to New York with my company in the summer of 2020, but obviously that didn't work out. So I did have a lot of additional time that I wanted to invest in a productive way, and I'm so glad it did, because I really think that Hive played a major role in my own healing process. Like, I'm proud to say that at this point I'm a depression survivor. I am the happiest I've been in many, many years. And I don't think I would be where I am today if I hadn't taken that leap at the beginning of the pandemic to start working on something on the side.
Yeah. No, that's incredible. And thank you so much for sharing it. And it goes to show, right, that by being vulnerable, by taking action, you can not just help others, but also yourself, right? And to really kind of go through it almost, right, together with an audience, and at the same time benefit it in your own personal development. And you mentioned, so you started, and I mean, being selfishly kind of now starting a podcast, I would love to get as much knowledge from you as possible about hosting a podcast. But just as someone who might be listening, right, and also thinking, oh, I would love to start a podcast, but I just don't know to begin. I mean, you had some radio experience, but is there one or two things that you would recommend to someone who just really would love to, get into this podcasting game, but just really don't know where to start?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the biggest challenges that people face is like a mindset challenge. And what I mean by that is, like, a lot of people who don't have any background in like journalism or editing or audio recording, they think, oh my goodness, like putting a podcast out there is such a complicated technical process, which if you had told me this 10 years ago, then I probably would have agreed. But nowadays, there is a gazillion and one platforms and tools that help amateur podcasters to get started. So, there's really like three things that you need to get started as a podcast host. One is a hosting platform. That's kind of where your digital recordings live in the virtual space, and through their RSS feed they push your podcast to all of these distribution platforms such as Apple Podcasts and Spotify and whatnot. So that's number one. Number two is some sort of like a virtual recording tool. I know a lot of people who use Zoom, for example. It's free. We right now are recording on Riverside. I personally use Zencaster for my recordings, but there's so many more tools out there, and it's usually a browser environment. After having been on a gazillion Zoom and Teams calls over the pandemic, this shouldn't feel too different. So that's number two, and the third one is really like a decent mic. And when I say decent mic, I'm not saying, hey, you have to spend $500 on a professional mic. I think the mic that I got cost like $70. So not that much from like an upfront investment perspective. Like, yes, there are recurring monthly costs from like a hosting perspective, but
Mm-hmm.
even there, I think there's free platforms. I just
Yeah.
chose to pay a little bit of money to have like a better user experience. Um, so once you really know that it doesn't take that much from a technical setup perspective, I think the next step is to really like reflect, okay, like what is it that I want to share with people? Like, what is the unique perspective that I have, and who are some of the guests that I could bring in to further amplify that overall message that I want to share. So definitely recommend making a list of like your dream guests. You know, there can be like tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, because usually if you don't already have a pre-established brand, it'll be a bit difficult for you to land those like tier 1 guests. But like everyone has to start somewhere. You know, the biggest podcast hosts in the world, they started from scratch at some point and they showed up consistently. And over time, you know, their efforts and time investments started to pay off.
What you said about it's in our head, I think that is so true for so many things, like not even podcasting, any other thing that a person might be considering of doing, right? Because if we take podcasting as an example, you think like, oh, the barrier to entrance is so big because maybe I'm not a techie person and I have to get all this equipment and it's so scary. But at the end, like you just laid out, it's not. You need like three things. Most of it is really your attitude and your mindset towards it. And then, right, like just staying consistent. And I think so many of us even forget, like, we have already all these tools. Like you said, like the one thing that COVID did probably made us all Teams and Zoom specialists. So we already know how to do that, right? And I think with so many things that are especially online, if it's, I don't know, blogger, influencer, podcaster, or even maybe coach, right? People are always so scared to do it. But I think at the end of the day, you really have to realize actually so many of the skills you already have. So I think that is a really, really valuable learning.
Thank you. Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. And well, talking about then your podcast, I guess that was your first, would say like big side hustle that you started, right? And now you also created this other platform that you have, Give Her Dollars. Was that something that kind of you created as an addition to the podcast, or how was your thought process around that?
So Give Her Dollars was more intended to be a rebrand of Hive, because Hive
Mm-hmm.
served its purpose. But when I embarked on this new journey of moving to New York last year, I felt like I had almost outgrown Hive. I was
Mm-hmm.
just in a different chapter of my life. Um, and something that I realized over time is that the topic of personal finance and investing seemed to resonate the most with my audience. And
Mm-hmm.
over the course of the pandemic, I started following a lot of incredible female personal finance content creators
Mm-hmm.
online, and it was just incredibly powerful to me to see tens of thousands of women from around the world like educate themselves on how to
Mm-hmm.
develop a better relationship with money, how to start investing and build a sustainable financial future for themselves and their loved ones. So I felt like I needed to niche down a little bit. So I did the rebrand this past fall. And Give Her Dollars is now really meant to help women build wealth for themselves and other women. So, contrary
Mm-hmm.
to some other personal finance content creators who focus on educational content on how to get started with investing, I do talk about that as well, but it's always from that specific lens. Okay, how can you pay it forward to other women? Like, reflect on what you're
Mm-hmm.
investing right now. Is that aligned with your personal values? Like, how many companies are you invested in that proactively support women in
Mm-hmm.
leadership, for example, right? But then the conversation also naturally evolves from there, from like personal finance and saving and investing for retirement, for example, but also to like supporting female founders through angel investing, like shedding some light
Mm-hmm.
on venture
Hmm.
capital, because we all know that the gender funding gap is still a massive, massive problem. Like this past year in 2022, only 1.9% of all VC funding went to female founded startups. And
Wow.
I think that is, if
Hmm.
we equipped a broader set of women with the knowledge and access to these opportunities, we could create some sustainable change. And I'm not saying that you need to be so wealthy that you can write like six-figure checks. That's not what I'm trying to say. These days, again, because of the advent of of the internet and some incredible technical tools and platforms, you can start investing in startups with as little as $50, right? But I think if we really
Hmm.
mobilized a bigger group of women globally to start thinking about, okay, how can I not only build wealth for myself, but how can I actually, in everything that I do and how I spend money and how I invest money, how can I do that from that gender perspective? Like, can I, when I buy presents for someone, can I buy it from like a female owned business, for example? When I invest in companies, can I make sure that they have enough female representation on their C suite or on their senior leadership in general? Can I maybe invest, like, I don't know, 1K into an early stage female founded startup that specifically works on solving a problem that benefits other women? So really thinking about, how can I align
Hmm.
my
Hmm.
spending and investment behavior with my own personal values, with the ultimate goal of making progress as it pertains to gender equity and gender equality.
Yeah. And that just pertains, I think, to these bigger conversation around, right? Like when women support women, I think there's this popular quote, big things can happen, right? Or like magic happens. And I found that to be so true. Because I think from, I don't know, like I guess a society standpoint or what we hear even, right? Like kind of in Hollywood or all these like big spaces, it's always like women competing with women. And probably it used to be because there weren't so many women in corporate spaces, right? So there was always like this sense of, oh, I have to compete with this woman. Otherwise, she will snap that job away from me. But I think really the mindset shifted, and people like you doing this incredible work to really, talking about paying forward, talking about supporting other women, and really, kind of educating people and men as well, because I think men are also a big, big puzzle piece here, right? To really close this gender pay gap. But yeah, right, just really just start this conversation that it doesn't have to be a competition. There is, enough room for everyone to flourish, and amazing things can happen when you feel and have that support.
Yes, 100%. I think that is so, so important to your point. Like, yes, in the past there weren't as many slots for women, especially in senior
Mm.
leadership positions. Like, even from personal experience, like I shared about this like a couple of weeks ago on LinkedIn, I used to see other women as competition as well,
Hmm. Hmm.
aspiring for a career in sports journalism, as
Hmm.
you know, a very male dominated space. And I
Very.
was always fearing, like, oh, what if like the guys, like the other women in the room better than me, does that mean that like I have to try to outperform, outsmart, out hustle the other women? And it took quite some time for me to realize, and especially now looking back a couple of years later, like, no, even if that other woman
Hmm.
had been more successful than me in that space, that would have still meant that she would have made progress for all other women,
Yeah.
myself included. And yes, luckily, we're seeing some structural changes, and companies and employers and organizations as a whole, moving towards being more inclusive. Don't get me wrong, there's still
Yeah.
a lot of work that needs to be done, especially in male dominated spaces. There's still lots of like unconscious bias and microaggressions, specifically against women of color as well. Um, but at the end of the day, it's all about a mindset shift. And I do think there's also a generational a generational difference, just because there is now more opportunities for women compared to like 20, 30 years ago. And
Yeah.
something else that I think is important, and this comes to mind because I just talked about it on my Instagram story
Yeah.
this morning. For a woman to be successful in the past, they really had to lean into their traditionally male energy in order to become part, or attempt to become part of the good old boys network, right?
Mm-hmm.
To play with the big boys.
Yeah.
um and that oftentimes meant that they had to sacrifice parts of their femininity. A lot of them had to probably learn how to like golf or sail, talk sports and whatnot, and they really betrayed their female energy. And as of recently, over the past couple of years, there's been a new narrative that started to evolve, where women like, no, like, it's actually incredible for women to lean into their female energy. There is a lot of greatness, like being a compassionate leader, for example. And just because I like the color pink, for example, and I like wearing lipstick, doesn't mean I'm dumb or can't do business. I can be both. I can look feminine, show up in a traditionally feminine way, and still close deals and still make money. In the past, we felt like these are mutually exclusive because we wanted to reduce women to their
Yeah.
stereotypes, and wanted women to meet the expectations of what society's expectations of their gender. But we can actually do both and kick ass while doing so.
100%. This resonates so deeply with me because I went through the same learning curve and actually even found that in the process of kind of trying to succeed in the corporate space, like lost some of my like femininity because I always tried to be like, tough and not let any emotions out. But I don't know, this year and past year, I've started really working on this and realizing like, hey, yes, I'm an emotional person, but actually that's not something bad. It's great if you're an emotional person. It's great if you can, connect on an emotional level, maybe with your coworkers, to show compassion. I mean, Jacinda Ardern, I think, is an amazing, amazing example of how a woman can be president, right? And show compassion and be really emotional, or like in tune with her emotions, but at the same time, super powerful and super strong. I mean, when she brought, I think, her baby to like one of the big parliament meetings, I was like sitting at home applauding because I think that just showed to so many women that we are freaking rock stars, right? I mean, look at Rihanna performing at the Super Bowl pregnant. It's incredible, I think, what women can accomplish, and we really have to, think about this and not let all these stereotypes take away our superpower of being feminine.
Yes, absolutely. Louder for the people in the back.
Well, and talking, I guess, about femininity, if you would like to talk about it, I was really, really impressed that you also shared more about your fertility on LinkedIn. I think you talked a little bit about your egg retrieval process, and even that, kind of not many people open up about this. And you're still pretty young, right? You're in your 20s. I feel like even this whole conversation people don't really have in the 20s. I feel like it's something that maybe people consider in their 30s, but it's really important to think about this and have these conversations now. Or I guess the younger you are, the better, right? Because there's a lot of things I also learned recently that you really have to consider, because unfortunately there is a biological clock and we have to consider this, especially if you have career aspirations. And with finance, I think it also really relates. So I would just love to know what inspired you to share this openly, and how did this relate to kind of all the other topics you were previously talking about openly?
Yeah, absolutely. So to take a step back, like why I decided to share this publicly, because it is something very personal and intimate, right?
Very.
Um, but one of my biggest, most important values in life is authenticity and vulnerability. And throughout my work with Femme, Hive, and relationships I was able to build over time, I've just come to realize that showing up as your most authentic self and allowing yourself to be vulnerable in front of others is actually a strength. And I randomly shared on my Instagram story over the summer that I was considering freezing
Mm-hmm.
my eggs, but I didn't really think about it that much. And what happened afterwards was so many people reaching out to me asking if I could share more about that process. And at the time, I was very ill equipped to talk about it because I don't have a medical
Mm-hmm.
background and I hadn't gone through fertility preservation just yet. So when I received all of these messages from women around the world, I was like, wow, I just hit a nerve. So what I ended up doing is I started capturing my journey on Instagram, and with every day and every week that went by I was sharing my personal experience around egg freezing specifically. And yeah, to your point earlier, I found out throughout the process that unfortunately at age 28 my fertility has already declined, specifically my ovarian egg reserve.
Mm-hmm.
So the quantity of my eggs has declined and is lower compared to what the average woman my age would have. And obviously that was not something that a 28-year-old woman wants to hear or expects to hear. For me, I thought this was going to be like a one and done kind of deal. Like I have a lot of my plate on my plate, so I was like, oh, I have this 2-3 week long window where I could like squeeze that in and be done with it and
Mm-hmm.
forget about it until it's time to actually start thinking about having children one day. But yeah, obviously those news were shocking, and it was a big learning curve for me because to your point earlier, when you're in your 20s, you don't really think about fertility, and you definitely do not consider your fertility being potentially um, already on the decline at age 28. And so that's been one of my biggest learnings. Like every woman's body is different, and that's why I think we need to create more awareness. And that's exactly why I decided to go public with that, not only on Instagram, where I have a bit more of an intimate community, but also on LinkedIn, because at the end of the day, a woman's career and a woman's fertility are inevitably
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
interconnected. Ideally, we would live in a world where um, we we wouldn't have to freeze our eggs in the first place, because our society would create an environment where it is possible for women to both have a fulfilling, impactful career, but also have biological children at the same time, right? And not
Yeah.
be penalized for motherhood. But unfortunately, we're still very far away from that reality, right? So oftentimes for women who are very career driven, like fertility preservation is something they should consider thinking about. And again, my learning curve has been so steep, and I learned a lot about the female process and women's reproductive health throughout this process. And my biggest piece of advice, because again, I'm not a doctor, so don't come to me for medical advice. I can only share my own personal experience, and my personal experience looks very different from another woman's personal experience. But what my biggest piece of advice is to all the women out there, even if you're still in your mid 20s or late 20s, go seek out a specialist, not an OBGYN, because surprisingly, a lot of them are not specialists when it comes to fertility. You
Yeah.
would think so, but
Mm-hmm.
no. Go seek out a fertility and fertility preservation specialist. Go make an appointment with a fertility clinic just to get your fertility checked. And that's not a very involved process. It usually requires just some blood work and an ultrasound, just like your regular checkup that you would have at your OBGYN. That way they can test your hormone levels, and they can look at how many follicles you have in your ovaries, and based on that they can tell you, oh, you're totally on track, you're still very fertile. Oh, you might have some other underlying conditions
Mm-hmm.
that might make it more challenging for you to conceive naturally in the future. So for me specifically, my doctor told me, look, you have fewer eggs available than I would have expected given your age. You're actually a perfect candidate and should probably do this sooner rather than later. And like a month later, I was starting the process. Yeah, so that's my biggest plea to everyone out there. please schedule a consultation with a specialist, because that will allow you to make educated decisions about your body and create more opportunities for yourself in the future.
That's amazing advice. And I mean, knowledge is power, right? And I think with this, such an important part, right, of our lives, especially for women who, right, like who have this desire to have children and have a career, like you said. And I think there's still a lot of stigma around it, right? That maybe you think like, oh, I'll just wait a couple of years and it will be fine. Maybe some are even a bit scared to find out what's actually going on, right? So I think it's super important, the advice you're giving, to just really, right, like just to be informed. And then you can do with the information whatever you want. But at the end of the day, just to have this knowledge, just to have, the decision power, right? Like almost to take back the power to make the decisions for yourself and your body and your future family. I think it's something super, super powerful and incredibly inspiring. So thank you for sharing your story.
Thank you. And maybe if I can add to that, again, this is something we could probably spend another like hour talking
Yes.
just about that. But like, I think there's so many misconceptions around fertility and women's reproductive health, right? There's actually doctors, like real doctors out there, telling women that they should wait with egg freezing or fertility preservation until age 36, but at that point
That's
in time it
horrible.
might already be too late for a lot of women. Like if I had waited until age 36, I probably wouldn't have been able to have biological children. And at that point in time, it usually also takes more rounds of egg freezing to get to the desired number of eggs that you need in order to have a good attempt at one live birth, and like all the emotional and financial implications of that. I think if you are younger, please engage with that topic sooner rather than later. And now I will stop talking about it.
No, please do not stop talking about this and continue this important conversation. I think I read an interview with Jennifer Aniston recently, who, I mean, for so many years, right, was in the media like, what's wrong with her? She just wants a career, and that's why Brad Pitt left her, because she didn't want to have babies. Like, also horrible. Something probably we can also chat about for a long time, like that people ask women all these inappropriate questions that they have no business about asking. But yeah, and I think in this interview she said like, well, she was having issues with her fertility and she wishes that she would have known about egg freezing, and she wishes that she would have done it at an early age, but she didn't. And at the time when she felt ready, it was too late, right? So I think that just goes to show, right, like, be informed. Don't be afraid to go to the doctor to get yourself checked out, and then you can take the information or leave it, but just don't be afraid to take that super important first step when it comes to fertility and family planning.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember reading that interview because I think it came out like it was with Allure, I think, came out pretty much around the time when I was going through my process last fall. So yeah, definitely resonated resonated with me a lot.
Well, I would love to chat on for so long, for so much longer time, but I want to be respectful of your time. So before we just wrap things up, would love to go to get to my final segment of final threes, just to have three quick takeaways for listeners on a couple of things that we talked about. So the first question is, what helped you to go from idea of wanting to start your, I guess, various side hustles like the Femme Hive or Give Her Dollars, to actually doing it? So what was this thought process of, I have this idea, and then actually taking that first step?
I would say just focus on ruthless execution. Like I'm not someone who likes to overthink. I'm someone who loves doing. And so I think always prioritizing just execution and having like a MVP, minimal viable product, is key, because you can wait a long time to to create something that is perfect. It will never end up being perfect. So sometimes done is better than perfect.
I love that. Done is better than perfect. That's a great quote to think of. Question two: what was your biggest fear when you decided to show yourself authentically and openly on LinkedIn? And did that fear come true?
Yeah, so one of my biggest fears was probably what my coworkers and my managers would think.
Mm-hmm.
And for the longest time, I had the self-limiting belief of not being able to show up authentically and vulnerably on LinkedIn, and it resulted in me limiting my self-expression. But once I actually overcame that fear, the feedback was phenomenal, including from my own manager and coworkers of mine. So never let that self-limiting belief hold you back.
Oh, amazing, amazing advice. And final question, I guess, on your entire career and life journey, if you would have to pick one, what was your greatest learning?
Surround yourself with people who act as cheerleaders, who are supporters, mentors, sponsors for you, who tell you 10 reasons for why you will succeed and not 10 reasons for why you will fail. And that's actually one of the biggest reasons why I left Germany and ended up in the US, because that environment is a lot more conducive to that entrepreneurial starter mentality mindset.
Yeah, 100%. Well, Thamina, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sharing all your learnings. Most importantly, thank you for doing this amazing, amazing work, and keep fighting the good fight. Absolutely loved our conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a blast. Thank you for all your thoughtful questions. And I hope that this conversation will help some of the people out there who might be wondering how to build a personal brand or how to show up vulnerably or even egg freezing. So thank you for allowing me to tell my story.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, and have a wonderful rest of your day.